The cursed wedding dress. The dress moved in the shadows. At least, that's what the villagers whispered about the ancient wedding gown that had clothed 7 generations of brides in the hills of Nyambi Valley. Now, it waited for dawn, a headstrong young woman who believed only in what she could see with her own eyes. But some truths, they say, can only be seen with the heart. And the ancestors were growing impatient. In Sweet Promises Bridal Boutique, Dawn scrolled through designer wedding dresses on her phone, surrounded by gleaming white gowns that caught the sunlight streaming through tall windows. "Can you believe people still wear family heirlooms?" she laughed, nudging her best friend, Joy. She showed her a picture of a particularly ornate dress she had her heart set on. "Look at this one, it's perfect." But as she spoke, the lights flickered, and a chill swept through the room. Dawn shivered and glanced at the mirror beside her. It was clouded briefly, then for a moment, she could have sworn she saw other faces reflecting back at her, faces of women she'd only seen in old family photos. That evening, as Dawn walked through the village marketplace, the earthy smell of spices and herbs filled the air. She was nearly home when old Mother Maya called out to her. The elder, with her wise eyes and shaking hands, waved her closer. Her small shop smelled of dried herbs and history, something about it making Dawn's skin prickle with unease. "Child," Mother Maya murmured as she pressed a small cloth pouch containing red beads and herbs into Dawn's palm, "I heard you visited the bridal shop today. The ancestors are watching, Dawn. They don't smile on pride." Dawn tried to laugh it off, but as she turned away, the wind picked up, scattering red flower petals across her path. She shivered, remembering the old saying her grandmother used to whisper, "When red flowers fall without a tree, the spirits have come to watch and see." That night, Dawn tossed and turned, her sleep haunted by a vivid dream. She found herself standing in a dimly lit room, facing a tall, elegant woman whose face held both warmth and sternness. Dawn recognized her instantly. It was her great-grandmother, Sarah, whom she'd only seen in family photos. In the dream, Sarah was dressed in the family wedding gown, the fabric shimmering with an inner light that cast long shadows around the room. "Child of my child," Sarah said, her voice as steady as thunder, "why do you turn from your heritage? Why do you seek empty glamour over the power of your bloodline?" Dawn tried to answer, to explain that she wanted something modern, something different. But the words stuck in her throat. Around her, red flowers bloomed and withered in rapid succession, the room filled with whispered songs in languages she didn't understand but knew were her ancestors' voices. When she jolted awake, she found scattered red petals on her pillow. The next day, Dawn went to visit her grandmother, Grandmother Maya, who had called the family together to discuss wedding preparations. The gathering of elders was a tradition for every bride to be in the village, though Dawn would have preferred a more private meeting. Sitting in the circle of family members, she felt the weight of their eyes on her, as if they were watching for signs of doubt. "Dawn," Grandmother Maya began, her voice calm but firm, "our family wedding dress is not just fabric. It's a link to those who came before us, a promise kept alive through generations. You carry their hopes and dreams within you, whether you wear the dress or not." Dawn tried to hide her frustration, nodding politely, but she couldn't help feeling that the dress was a burden she hadn't asked for. Her aunt, Amma, leaned in with a knowing look. "We see you hesitate, child," she whispered, "but know this, the dress does not like to be denied." As if in agreement, the gust of wind swept through the room, rattling the windows. Despite the strange occurrences, Dawn brushed off her family's warnings and went back to the bridal shop that afternoon, determined to choose a dress she could truly call her own. But as she stood in front of the fitting room mirror, something felt wrong. The mirror's surface shimmered as though it was water, and as she peered closer, she saw her reflection wearing not the modern gown she had selected, but her family's wedding dress. She blinked, startled, but the vision didn't disappear. Instead, her reflection began to move on its own, staring back at her with a look of sorrow and something else, disappointment. You carry our legacy, the reflection seemed to whisper, though its mouth didn't move. Dawn stumbled back, knocking into a rack of dresses, but when she looked again, her reflection was back to normal. Heart pounding, she left the shop without making a purchase, her mind spinning. That evening, Dawn's best friend, Joy, stopped by her house for dinner. Joy's family had stories of their own. A distant cousin had famously refused to wear her family's heirloom wedding dress and had bought a modern gown instead. Joy recalled the story with a shiver. "They say strange things happened at her wedding," Joy whispered as they ate. The lights kept flickering, and guests said they felt an icy chill even though it was summer. "And, well, they say she's been plagued with bad luck ever since." Dawn laughed it off, trying to brush aside the thought. But deep down, the stories were starting to make her uneasy. Could refusing her family's dress really bring bad luck? Still, she told herself, they were just old stories, superstitions meant to keep people in line. The following morning, Dawn found a parcel waiting for her on her doorstep. Wrapped carefully in thick brown paper was the family wedding dress, placed there by her grandmother. No note, no explanation. Just the dress draped over a wooden stand, with the folds catching the morning light. Dawn stared at it, feeling an inexplicable pull. She swore the dress was waiting for her, its embroidered patterns seeming to shift under her gaze. With a mixture of defiance and curiosity, she left it there and went inside. But as she tried to go about her day, she couldn't stop thinking about it. By nightfall, she found herself standing at the doorway, watching the dress as shadows deepened around it. And once again, the memory of her great-grandmother's stern warning drifted through her mind, "Why do you turn from your heritage?" That night, a sudden storm rolled over the village, bringing with it a torrent of rain and fierce winds. Dawn lay in bed, listening to the thunder, when she heard a soft rustling sound from outside. She crept to the window and peered into the night, her eyes widening as she saw the wedding dress, now drenched and fluttering in the wind. In the lightning flashes, she could have sworn the dress was moving on its own, as if being worn by an invisible figure. Terrified but unable to look away, she watched as the dress seemed to float toward her door, pausing just outside. She scrambled back to her bed, heart pounding, and pulled the covers over her head, praying the storm would end and take the dress with it. The next day, Dawn confronted her grandmother, demanding an explanation. Grandmother Maya simply gave her a knowing smile and handed her a small, intricately carved box. "Inside are beads from our ancestors, worn by every bride in our family," she explained. "These beads carry the blessings and stories of all those who came before you." As Dawn held the beads, she felt a strange warmth, as if the spirits of her ancestors were gathering around her. "The dress is more than cloth, Dawn," her grandmother continued. "It carries our family's strength. You may not understand yet, but soon you will see." Dawn nodded, though her skepticism remained. Still, she couldn't deny the sense of connection she felt while holding the beads, the weight of something ancient and enduring pressing on her heart. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Dawn held the beads her grandmother had given her, feeling the weight of history in her hands. She placed them beside her bed and drifted into a restless sleep. In the early hours of the morning, as dawn broke, she awoke to a vision that felt more vivid than any dream. She was standing in her village, but everything was draped in shadows and mist. In front of her stood her great-grandmother, Sarah, who extended a hand. Dawn reached out, and as their fingers touched, she felt a surge of memories, weddings, struggles, joys, and sorrows from countless generations. It was overwhelming, yet grounding, as if she were part of something much larger than herself. When she woke, she was clutching the beads tightly, a sense of reverence filling her heart. The morning after her vision, Dawn went to the village library. She had never paid much attention to her family's history, but now she felt compelled to understand. Among the dusty archives, she found records dating back to her great-grandmother's time and earlier. Each bride was documented, their wedding attire and lives recorded with remarkable detail. And in nearly every account, the family wedding dress was mentioned, with stories of its special energy and the bride's shared reverence for it. One passage, however, made her heart race. The bride who denies the dress it warned will inherit a life of shadows. Though she dismissed it as a mere superstition, her hands trembled as she turned the pages. She closed the book, unsettled but unable to shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. As if drawn by her own worries, Dawn couldn't help but revisit the story Joy had told her about the other bride who had rejected her own family dress. She reached out to Joy, who managed to put her in touch with the woman Adisa. Adisa's voice was tense when they spoke. She recounted how, after refusing her family's wedding dress, she had been plagued by strange misfortunes, illnesses, a failed marriage, and unexplained cold drafts in her home. "Some things, Dawn, are more than just stories," Adisa said quietly. "I don't know what you believe, but the dress, your family's traditions, they have power. If I could do it over, I would respect that." Dawn listened, feeling both skeptical and fearful. Could rejecting her family's traditions really invite misfortune? The call left her deeply unsettled. Later that night, Dawn lay awake, the wind whispering around her windows. She thought of the dress, how it had seemed to move on its own, how the elders had spoken of it with such reverence. Determined to lay her doubts to rest, she decided to confront her fears directly. She slipped outside in the cool night air and made her way to where the dress still hung, now protected in her grandmother's attic. As she stood before it, her heart raced. With trembling hands, she reached out and brushed her fingers over the fabric. A surge of warmth spread through her hand, as if the dress recognized her touch. The embroidered patterns seemed to shift under her fingers, and Dawn felt a surge of strange comfort. Could it be that the dress truly held her ancestors' love? But before she could think further, she heard her name faintly whispered on the wind. Startled, she pulled her hand back and hurried out of the attic, a newfound reverence mixed with fear. The next day, Dawn's grandmother called her to a family gathering. They sat in a circle as Grandmother Maya recounted tales of the women in their family who had worn the dress. "Each one of us faced a challenge, the struggle of our own. The dress became our armor," she explained. "It's not only about tradition, it's about strength passed down from one bride to the next." She looked at Dawn intently. "Our stories live on because we remember them, and they protect us because we honor them." Dawn felt a pang of shame for her earlier resistance, but she remained silent, listening as each family member shared a story of resilience and love tied to the dress. By the end of the gathering, Dawn's heart felt heavy with the weight of their legacy, but also more connected than ever. In the following days, Dawn decided to try on the dress just once, to see if it would help calm her growing anxiety. She put it on carefully, feeling the fabric settle around her like a second skin. It fit her perfectly, the way a custom-made dress would. Then she felt an unexpected wave of pride. But as she looked into the mirror, her reflection seemed to change. Shadows gathered around her, distorting the room, and she saw glimpses of her ancestors standing behind her, their faces proud, yet somber. Whereas, with honor, they seemed to say, their voices echoing in her mind. Dawn stumbled back, her hands shaking as she removed the dress. She was no longer sure if she could dismiss the power it seemed to hold. After her experience with the dress, Dawn felt torn. A part of her still clung to her desire for a modern wedding, a celebration that reflected who she was. Yet, she couldn't deny the influence of the family dress, nor the stories it carried. Finally, she sought advice from her fiancé, Kai. Kai listened quietly, his eyes thoughtful. "Dawn, I've always respected you for being true to yourself. But if this dress is part of your family's spirit, maybe it's not something to fear. Maybe it's something to honor, to add to who you are." His words comforted her, and she felt a newfound determination to respect her heritage without losing herself. The night before the wedding, Dawn experienced another unsettling dream. She was back in the attic, standing before the dress. This time, her ancestors surrounded her, their expressions grave. "Tomorrow you make your choice," they said in unison. "Respect the legacy, and the blessing will be yours. Reject it, and shadows will follow you." Dawn awoke in a cold sweat, her heart racing. The dreams had been growing stronger, and she could no longer ignore them. She made her way to the attic once more, standing before the dress. She felt as though her ancestors were with her, urging her to embrace her legacy. But she still wondered, was it her decision, or had it been made for her long before she was born? The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear. Dawn dressed in silence, her heart pounding as she slipped into the family gown. It felt different now, like a gentle embrace, as though it had finally accepted her. She caught her reflection in the mirror and saw her ancestors' faces overlaying her own, their pride and strength mirrored in her eyes. As she walked to the altar, the guests gasped at the dress's beauty. Whispers ran through the crowd as they saw how the gown seemed to shimmer, its patterns alive in the sunlight. Dawn felt an overwhelming sense of peace, her fears dissolving as she moved through the ceremony, fully embracing her heritage. After the ceremony, Dawn's grandmother pulled her aside. With a tearful smile, Grandmother Maya handed her a small, worn charm. "This was given to me by my own grandmother on my wedding day," she said softly. "It's meant to protect the wearer from harm and to guide you through any hardship." Dawn slipped the charm into her pocket, feeling its warmth. She now understood that her family's legacy was more than just a tradition, it was a living bond that would watch over her. For the first time, she felt the pride her ancestors must have carried, knowing that they were part of something larger than themselves. As the evening turned to night, Dawn joined her family and friends in a traditional wedding dance, a joyful celebration beneath a canopy of stars. But as they danced, she noticed a strange phenomenon. Shadows moved alongside them, mirroring their steps with a ghostly grace. One of the older villagers whispered to her, "The ancestors have come to bless you, child. They are dancing with you." Dawn felt her heart swell as she realized that her ancestors had accepted her choice, and the family legacy would live on, its power both a gift and a reminder of where she came from. Days after the wedding, Dawn found herself thinking constantly about the dress and the charm her grandmother had given her. She wore the charm daily, feeling its comforting weight as she went about her tasks. Yet, every so often, she felt a strange, tingling warmth radiate from it, as if it was watching over her. Villagers continued to whisper about her wedding, some even claiming they'd seen ghostly figures in the shadows during the dance. Dawn brushed it off as superstition but felt her curiosity grow with each passing day. One evening, she dreamt of her grandmother as a young bride, standing in the family dress, looking radiant yet somber. "We are always here," her grandmother's voice echoed in the dream. "Remember us, and we will guide you." When Dawn woke, she found a single red flower on her windowsill, a reminder that the spirits of her ancestors were never far. Soon after her wedding, Dawn ran into Adisa, the woman who had warned her about the dangers of neglecting family tradition. Adisa congratulated her, but there was a strange, almost resentful edge to her voice. Dawn noticed that Adisa wore a new necklace with a charm much like the one her grandmother had given her, though it seemed darker somehow, its surface tarnished. "I've decided to reclaim my family's legacy too," Adisa said, eyes gleaming with an intensity that made Dawn uncomfortable. "If you can receive your ancestors' blessing, then so can I." Dawn nodded politely, sensing a challenge behind Adisa's words. That night, she wondered what consequences lay in store for those who approached tradition with envy rather than respect. The village elders invited Dawn and Kai to an evening gathering where they would recount stories and celebrate their union. During the ceremony, Dawn noticed small omens scattered around, a red flower petal here and an unexplained chill there. The elders, seated in a circle around a fire, shared tales of the valley's ancient spirits and the importance of honoring family legacies. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air and the fire blazed brighter. The village chief took it as a sign. The ancestors are pleased, he declared, but they also warn us. Be mindful of the shadows, for not all spirits come with good intentions. Dawn felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew that her family's spirits were watching closely, but the chief's words left her wondering if some unseen force might try to challenge her new role as the bearer of their legacy. One night, while cleaning her home, Dawn glanced at her reflection in the hallway mirror. To her horror, the reflection showed her standing in the ancestral dress, though she was in her everyday clothes. Behind her, ghostly figures lingered, their faces half hidden in shadows. She blinked, and the figures vanished, leaving only her shaken reflection. The dress seemed to be calling her again, reminding her that her connection to it, and to her ancestors, was deeper than she'd realized. She hurried to tell Kai, who listened intently and suggested they revisit her grandmother for advice. Back at her grandmother's home, Dawn described the strange vision. Grandmother Maya listened calmly, nodding. The dress is not only a symbol, child, she explained. It is a vessel. Through it, the ancestors speak and guide you. They chose you, and now they need you to listen. She instructed Dawn to keep the dress nearby and to meditate with it, asking the ancestors for guidance. Some spirits are kind, others less so. But remember, you carry their strength. They protect you as long as you honor them. That night, Dawn sat in silence before the dress, her eyes closed, whispering prayers to her ancestors, seeking their wisdom. Days later, Adisa visited Dawn unexpectedly, her eyes shadowed and distant. I had a dream, Adisa said, her voice laced with bitterness. In it, I wore my own family dress, and my ancestors embraced me. They told me I deserved the blessings just as much as you do. Dawn felt a pang of sympathy but noticed a dark aura surrounding Adisa, as though the resentment she carried had tainted her. Adisa leaned in close. Our families are tied, you know. I'll prove to them that I'm worthy. She left abruptly, leaving Dawn with a sense of foreboding. She wondered if Adisa's ambition might bring danger to them both. As days passed, strange incidents began to plague the village, crops withered, animals went missing, and an unusual number of red flowers began blooming in unusual places. The villagers whispered that something was out of balance, that the spirits were restless. Dawn sensed her ancestors' presence more strongly than ever, and the village elders grew increasingly concerned. Finally, her grandmother called Dawn to her side. It's Adisa, she said quietly. Her ancestors are angry, and in her attempt to claim their blessing, she has disturbed forces beyond her control. You, child, must remind her of the importance of humility. Dawn felt the weight of her grandmother's words and agreed to confront Adisa, knowing it was the only way to restore harmony. Dawn found Adisa at the edge of the village, near an ancient tree where the ancestors were said to rest. Adisa wore her family's dress, a tattered garment that seemed to glow with a dark, eerie light. Why do you get everything? Adisa hissed, her voice filled with anger. Why should you be the only one blessed? Dawn tried to reason with her, explaining that the blessings of the ancestors came from respect and acceptance, not from force or jealousy. But Adisa's resentment had already taken root. If I cannot have their blessing, then no one will, she declared, her voice echoing strangely in the night. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind encircled them, and shadows swirled around Adisa, twisting the dress into something monstrous. Dawn called upon her ancestors, feeling their warmth and strength rise within her. Hear me, ancestors of our blood, she whispered. Guide us back to harmony. As the wind howled, a spectral figure emerged from the shadows, an ancient ancestor, her face stern yet sorrowful. She turned to Adisa, her voice resonating like thunder. Child of my child, you have misused our legacy, sought power for selfish ends. This blessing is not a prize to be won, but a bond to be cherished. Adisa shrank back, her eyes wide with fear. The ancestor looked to Dawn, nodding approvingly. You have honored us with humility, with love. Know that we will stand with you always. As the ancestors' words faded, Adisa's dress returned to its worn state, the dark glow fading. The shadows lifted, and Adisa collapsed, humbled but safe. With the balance restored, peace returned to the village. Dawn visited her grandmother, who hugged her tightly, proud of how she had handled her trials. You have proven yourself worthy of our legacy, child, she said, eyes shining. You will carry it forward with strength and grace. In the following years, Dawn wore the ancestral dress at key moments, honoring her ancestors and the bond they had shared. She felt their presence in every important decision, every challenge. When her daughter was born, she whispered stories of the dress and its magic, knowing that one day, her daughter would wear it too. And so, the legacy continued, bound by love, respect, and the timeless connection between past and present. In her heart, Dawn carried her ancestors' blessings, and through her, their spirits lived on. Years later, as Dawn's daughter prepared for her wedding, she too felt the warmth of the ancestral dress. She slipped it on, feeling the weight of history, and as she looked into the mirror, her reflection shifted, revealing Dawn's face beside her, along with the faces of the ancestors. They smiled, their presence a reassuring warmth. Dawn's daughter smiled back, ready to honor her family's legacy. The family's story continued, the dress passing from one generation to the next, carrying with it the strength of those who had come before. And as each new bride wore it, the village gathered to sing, "Listen, children of today, do you hear?" The echoes of their ancestors responded, "Yes, we hear." For they knew that some stories were not just told but lived, woven into the very fabric of their lives.